Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Connecting with Student Voice and Lived Experience to Prevent Gender-Based Violence, presented by Our Watch. My name is Freya Rodway. I'm a Prevention Program Officer within the university's team at Our Watch, and I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar. We're thrilled to have garnered such a large turnout today and to welcome you for the next 75 minutes of learning together. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, it is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and recognise the continuing connection Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to land, culture, knowledge and language for over 65,000 years. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today, we will be discussing gender-based violence. We know gender-based violence is widespread across our society and touches the lives of many, many people. It's completely normal to have a strong reaction to what we will be talking about. And if you need to reach out, here are some numbers for support on the screen. If you or someone you know is impacted by sexual assault, domestic or family violence, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT via phone. Alternatively, you can use their web chat, which is available 24 hours a day. QLife provides support to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people, and they can be contacted at 1-800-184-527. You can also contact Lifeline or the Australian Human Rights Commission. And if you're a man concerned about your mental health, anger or behaviour and attitudes relating to violence, you can reach out to the Men's Referral Service on 1300-766-491. Our fantastic digital support today is Jess, and she is going to place these support details in the chat box. Jess will also share the code of conduct for today's webinar as well. Thanks so much, Jess. Live captions are available today. If you wish to access these, please select the closed captions button in the Zoom menu on your device. If you have any questions or require any assistance, please use the chat function to send a message to Jess, our digital support. We will hear from our three presenters, and then we will have time at the end of the presentations for questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function and indicate who the question is for, and we will endeavour to read out as many as we can at the conclusion of the presentations. So a little bit about Our Watch. Our Watch is a national not-for-profit organisation established in 2013 by the Victorian and Commonwealth governments. It is a leader in preventing gender-based violence against women and their children in Australia. We work with businesses, governments, individuals and communities to drive long-term cultural change where people live, work and play, including media, workplaces, universities and TAFEs and sporting organisations. We are joined today by three very impressive minds to explore elements of the student life domain from Our Watch's Educating for Equality model. First up is Tash Makitis, Head of Training and Consulting Services at Full Stop Australia. Tash has 10 years experience in delivering training and consultancy services, specialising in prevention and response to gender inequality, sexual harassment and domestic, family and sexual violence. She has designed and continues to facilitate a range of Full Stop's training programs specific to higher education, including Responding with Compassion, Ethical Bystander Intervention and Ethical Pedagogical Practices, a prevention program aimed at HDR supervisors. Tash leads a team of multidisciplinary practitioners who combine Full Stop Australia's trauma specialist expertise, wide-ranging advocacy and lived experience collaboration into educational programs which drive meaningful change and contribute to ending gendered violence. Next is Saxon McGregor, current student and the immediate past president of the Bond University Student Association. During his leadership, Saxon led a culture of inclusion, respect and responsibility and played a key role in the whole of organisation approach to embedding gender equality and preventing gender-based violence. More broadly, Saxon is the Senior Resident Fellow of a residential college, Fellow of Welcoming Universities, and member of Bond University's Educating for Equality Framework Implementation Group. And lastly, we have Dr. Lucy Mercer-Mapstone, Executive Director of Collective Voices Consulting. Lucy has deep expertise in engagement, lived experience advocacy, human research, public speaking, facilitation, training, and in equity, diversity and inclusion. Lucy is a queer, neurodivergent disabled woman and a victim survivor of sexual assault. She has a long history of research, teaching, facilitation and advocacy around all of these lived experiences, driving social, cultural, organisational and legislative reform for a more inclusive society. Lucy integrates her first-hand navigation of systems of privilege and oppression into her engagements, making them authentic, inclusive and accessible. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our fabulous trio of presenters today and to thank you all very much for being here. Before we hear from our presenters, I'd like to provide some additional context about Our Watch's work with universities to date. Our Watch's Educating for Equality model, developed in collaboration with the sector, aims to provide universities with a whole of university approach to guide, support, and build upon existing work to promote gender equality and prevent gender-based violence. Educating for Equality draws on the national and international evidence base, including Change the Story, Australia's national framework for the primary prevention of violence against women. The Educating for Equality model identifies 5 key areas of focus, referred to as domains, for universities to operate in: business and operations, research, teaching and learning, workplaces, and student life. These are influenced by key levers: values and behaviours, structures and policies, and culture and norms. Domains are the where, and levers are the how. In 2025, Our Watch will be delivering a webinar on each of the 5 domains. You may have attended our first webinar, focused on the workplaces domain, in February. If you weren't able to attend, the full webinar will be posted on the Our Watch website soon. Today's webinar is, of course, focused on the student life domain, but will also support developing or progressing and implementing a whole of university approach. Indeed, Educating for Equality identifies student engagement as critical to implementing a whole of institution approach to promoting gender equality and preventing gender-based violence. This is echoed in the reporting mandates under the new National Code, which will require universities to utilise trauma-informed approaches and to work collaboratively with all students, including those with lived experience. The whole of university approach outlined in Educating for Equality is not intended to replace or duplicate existing work, and this is perhaps especially true in the context of student engagement. Adopting ethical and meaningful engagement practices is typically already occurring within universities and often with great success. However, we also hear from practitioners that a wide range of factors, including a post-COVID landscape, innate structural dynamics, and trying to sustain long-term engagement with a transient population, can make effective student engagement methods challenging in practice. We also hear from students in all their diversity of the barriers they face in having meaningful, safe, and respectful opportunities to engage in governance and decision-making on the issues of gender-based violence, an issue that impacts many students in significant ways. While we, of course, cannot solve these challenges in a single webinar, we hope the content covered today supports you as university staff and prevention practitioners or as student leaders to further sustain and progress best practice student engagement approaches as part of a whole of university approach to preventing gender-based violence. That's enough from me. Please do consult Educating for Equality for more information on taking a whole of approach to prevention in universities. Let's now hear from our speakers on how we can start to engage these levers in your university, looking specifically at the student life domain. Our first presenter is Tash. Over to you, Tash.
Thank you so much, Freya. Thank you. I am coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are joining us on the webinar today. Moving on to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a super brief overview of Full Stop Australia. So, Full Stop has been running the New South Wales Sexual Violence Helpline, which was originally the Rape Crisis Centre since 1974. On the screen there, you can see our 4 main counselling services, which is 1-800 Full Stop, New South Wales Sexual Violence Helpline, the National Rainbow Line, and we work across the National Redress Support Service as well. In addition to that, the other 2 arms of the organisation are education and advocacy, and I sit in the education space. All of our programs, projects, and the way in which we engage with survivor advocates is informed by 5 decades of trauma specialist service. So, on the next slide, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of the ways in which we do engage with survivor advocates. As a trauma informed, intersectional, feminist, and survivor centric organisation, Full Stop's engagement of lived experience advocates is based on the principles of safety, supporting recovery, prioritising victim survivor choice and agency, elevating diverse perspectives, and valuing victim survivors' lived experiences. We engage advocates and the broader responder and bystander community in several ways to create change and bring awareness to important issues through education and advocacy. We do this in several ways. So, one of those ways is the National Survivor Advocacy Program that's run by Full Stop. We have over 700 members across Australia who frequently comment through either face-to-face interviews, focus groups, or surveys on issues regarding changes to laws, for example, and other policy dependent changes. We do extensive community engagement and consultation. In workplaces and universities, we usually run focus groups and also work in one on one engagement to develop things like scenarios and educational resources. What's vital for us to consider is that in doing this, we may be asking people to relive their trauma, even inadvertently. And it's therefore essential that in any opportunity that we're asking survivor advocates to participate in, the process is scaffolded with trauma informed care, which is what I'm going to now define on the next slide. So, trauma informed is often used as a bit of a buzzword or a buzz phrase, which can really dilute its meaning. The definition that I find most often helps ground it in practice is the one that you're about to see on the screen there. Thank you. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event which overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. There's no objective criteria to evaluate what will cause post trauma symptoms, but the circumstances typically involve things like a loss of control, betrayal, and abuse of power, feelings of helplessness, pain, confusion, or loss. It's not a big leap to see how unsafe consultation or collaboration practices or really rigid response pathways can worsen or exacerbate those impacts of trauma by furthering feelings of helplessness and confusion and things like betrayal. So, the next few things that I want to share with you are the three elements of a trauma informed approach. And I might just ask for all three of those to appear on screen and I'll go through them. Thank you. The first one is recognizing the impact of trauma. Student advocates with lived experience may process information or navigate meetings differently. For example, a student might appear disengaged or reactive, which is not due to any type of disinterest, but because something has activated a trauma response. If we understand the impacts of trauma, if we are ensuring that we're never minimizing those experiences, we can shift from judgment to understanding, which will then help us to tailor more supportive engagement. Prioritizing safety, choice, and control through trauma informed engagement gives students options for how and when they participate, reducing or minimizing, where possible, the risk of re traumatization. So, for instance, students could choose to contribute anonymously via video or in writing, which protects their well being while also valuing their voice. And finally, students with lived experience are often reharmed in institutional spaces, so through being ignored or tokenized or re traumatized. Trauma informed practice means not just avoiding harm, but recognizing past missteps or mistakes and taking steps to rebuild that trust. Ignoring that history will only further deepen the divide and the disconnection between the student and the institution. Let's move forward to the next slide. And what I'm going to do now is take you through those 6 key principles of trauma informed practice when engaging student advocates in consultation, whether on policy development, service design, systemic responses to sexual violence. We apply trauma informed principles not just to the topic, but to how that consultation can be carried out. The framework that I find most useful for guiding non clinical organisations is actually from the New South Wales Ministry of Health, which they developed in partnership with Blue Knot. These 6 principles can be applied within professional frameworks and, where required, even mandatory reporting obligations. So I'm going to share each one with you and then give you some examples of what it could look like in practice. The first one on the screen is safety. How do we create and embed emotionally and culturally and psychologically and spiritually safe environments throughout all of the work that you do in a university, but especially in those spaces of consultation, collaboration, and co design when you are engaging with lived experience? In practice, this is about being intentional about where, when, and how consultations are held. So, accessible spaces, really clear agendas, and sensitive facilitation practices. Naming upfront that discussions may be emotionally activating and offering content warnings, as well as making it really clear what the opt in and opt out requirements are for participation. Offering support options before, during, and after engagement. So, survivor advocates that engage with Full Stop Australia are, of course, offered the option of calling our national service and an optional clinical debrief. In our experience, the level of clinical support needed is really dependent on the nature of the engagement and the subject matter that's covered. Our survey and interview questions are always reviewed by a senior clinical manager to ensure that they're trauma informed. And those managers will also support the selection of interview participants so that engagement and research is safe for everyone. So, this might include conversations with shortlisted candidates about safety planning, their existing supports, and any additional supports that we can provide. The second principle, which will appear on the screen, is trustworthiness. We build trust by being transparent, by being clear, and by being consistent. Students need to know the purpose of their involvement and how their input will be used and what limits exist. In practice, this is about being clear about decision-making powers. Is the consultation informing, shaping, or co-creating? It's about avoiding tokenism and only consult when student voices will meaningfully impact the outcome, not just to check a box. And sharing things like timelines, updates, feedback loops, so students know how their contributions are actually being actioned. On the next slide, we'll have a look at the third principle, which is choice. How do we guarantee students what control that they have over their participation and respect that people engage differently and may have limits on what they feel safe or ready to contribute? So, in practice, we look at ways to allow multiple modes of input. So, it could be anonymous surveys, one on one conversations, written submissions, not just group meetings. Letting students opt in to topics that feel relevant or meaningful to them and avoiding pressuring individuals to speak on behalf of entire communities or identities, and being clear that participation is voluntary and boundaries remain respected. The fourth principle is collaboration. So we think about ways to design consultation processes with student advocates, not just for student advocates. So valuing their knowledge and insights as essential, not secondary to the process. In practice, this might be involving student advocates early in agenda setting, in co design of questions, and facilitation planning. Recognizing the power imbalances between staff and students and actively working to flatten those hierarchies. And also treating student advocates as partners, not just stakeholders to consult and move on from. On the next slide, we'll have a look at the fifth principle of empowerment. In a university setting, especially when engaging with lived experience advocates, this means creating structures and processes and cultures that amplify student agency, build skills and confidence, and ensure that students are not just heard, but also influential. In practice, things like providing briefing or debriefing sessions, which really builds confidence and clarity around their role, creating paid or formally recognized roles for student consultants where possible. So at Full Stop, we pay survey participants $50 via a gift card and interview participants at a rate of $100 an hour for their lived experience. So that's our standard rate of pay for our National Survivor Advocacy Program and any type of community consultation that we engage in. It's also about involving student advocates in the design and review of initiatives, reporting tools, support services, not just as feedback givers, but as really proactive collaborators. Backing student led campaigns with resources, providing access to venues, printing, comms support, even small grants for peer led initiatives, and celebrating the contributions that students do make, especially lived experience students, recognizing student advocates in official reports, at events, through communication, sharing the wins that they've helped to create, and making those outcomes really visible to the broader university community. The last principle, but by of course no means least, is respect for diversity. Genuinely recognizing and valuing the diverse identities, experiences, and knowledges that student advocates can bring, especially in relation to things like culture, gender, sexuality, disability, neurodiversity, faith, lived experience of trauma, and marginalization. A trauma informed consultation process doesn't treat diversity as an afterthought, it actively centers it. So, in practice, we make sure that consultation includes a broad range of voices, particularly those who have been historically excluded or marginalized in university settings. We consider what methods and environments are culturally safe, which might mean separate or identity based sessions using translated materials or involving trusted cultural facilitators. Never assuming shared experience or universal student perspectives, and creating space for different types of knowledge, including lived experience, community based knowledge and experience, and non Western frameworks. And thinking about how all students can engage meaningfully. So, things like physical access, sensory safety, plain language resources, and flexible communication formats, and always reflecting on whose voices are missing and why, and being willing to shift methods or timelines to allow meaningful participation. When universities engage in trauma informed consultation, collaboration, and co design, it leads to safer, stronger, and more inclusive systems. And I hope that these last few slides have given you some additional practical ways to do this in addition to what you may already be doing. On the next slide, I'm just going to start to wrap up by going through the key university responsibilities to, hopefully take away from my segment of the presentation. So I think they'll all appear up on screen at the same time. Thank you. The first one there is nothing about us without us, which is a really common refrain, but centering student voices in decision making and in design. No complicity, no excuses, acknowledge the harm, take the action, and stop the silence. Make reporting clear and accessible. There should be no barriers, there should be no buried links, there should be no confusing systems, which will make support visible and easy to navigate so students don't have to chase help. Transparency and accountability are critical, so share your outcomes, close the feedback loops, show students that their voices lead to real and meaningful change. Respect for diversity in all of its forms, embedding cultural safety, accessibility, and intersectionality across every action. And finally, educate, empower, and act. Prevention is the responsibility of every single person in our communities and in our universities. So, all staff should be trained to make sure that every student is met with a compassionate, boundaried, and trauma informed response should they choose to disclose incidents of gender based violence. Bystanders should be equipped so that safe, active intervention is simple and supportive. And cultural change starts at the top. Senior leaders, boards of governance, counselors, they need to understand things like their positive duty obligations to support not just students, but staff as well. Moving on to the next slide, which is my final one, universities really need to listen to student survivor advocates to ensure that responses to gendered violence and prevention initiatives around gendered violence are informed, that they're effective, and most importantly, that they're centered on the needs of those who are impacted by gendered violence. So this has been the end of this is the end of my presentation. My contact details are there. Feel free to drop me an email at any stage, training@fullstop.org.au, or the numbers up there on the screen. Really happy for these slides to be shared after this training session as well. And thank you so much to Our Watch for giving me the space to share these materials and this content with you. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tash. It was so brilliant to have a really comprehensive outline of the principles of trauma-informed approaches and your incredibly useful advice for how universities can adopt these in practice. Thank you. I will now throw to our second presenter for the session, Saxon. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Tash, for that fantastic presentation. It's so wonderful to hear of the work that you're doing for Full Stop Australia, and it aligns nicely with what I have to follow. I'm joining from the Gold Coast on the lands of the Kumba people of the Yugambeh language group. And I wanted to thank Our Watch as well for the very kind invitation for me to share my experiences and hopefully some practical advice for you as well. And I wanted to thank you too. I can see some familiar and new names in the attendee list, and I understand, having been in this space as a student for 3 years and 4 months now, how thankless of a job that it can be. So I wanted to highlight and remind you of the impact that you have, and thank you on behalf of your students. Today was my last ever undergraduate class, so you've caught me at the perfect time to share some perspectives with that student hat still on. My presentation is framed under Our Watch's key levers for whole of organisation approaches to promoting gender equality and preventing gender-based violence, and I hope that what I share will be helpful for you to consider in your practice. Now, on the second slide, I didn't know this for a long time because it's intuitive, authentic, and it really goes without saying. But one of our university values at Bond is productive engagement between students and staff. And pictured there on the right is my team of former student leaders with the Vice Chancellor and University Registrar, who so admirably lead our institution and have set the highest standards of cultures that you don't want to leave, which I mean because I'm really not looking forward to my graduation in June. Our relationship is a special one, and it's what I consider to be the special and secret ingredient to our joint success. We value each other and recognise that we're here working for the same purpose and for the same people. On the next slide, you can see that our partnership isn't only clear in what we do, but in what we say, and that there is the preamble to our safety, respect, care, consent, student support strategy, which I'll reference again soon. But in that statement, we signal very plainly that everyone, students and staff, are responsible for cultivating a culture of inclusion, respect, and responsibility. By assigning our commitment to and responsibility for these imperatives, we genuinely mirror the whole of organisation ethos. And it means that students can respectively and openly speak truth to power. And our student experience outcomes are all the more positive because of that dynamic. In the same way, on the next slide, our structures and policies are best when they're co-designed, drafted, and signed. And instead of consulting students at the end of a policy drafting or review process or immediately before implementation, there are so many benefits to involving students in the entire process for you, them, and the wider university community. Now, when she first started, I bumped into our Chief Integrity Officer, and not long after we found our joint interest in policy and international relations, she invited me to have a seat at the table, which a few years ago, at the end of my first year of university, was a really special thing and something that I reflect back on really fondly. But to be part of our policy review process has, for me as a student, had two key benefits. And firstly, it's meant that our governance framework is directly informed by and relevant to students. Secondly, it gave me professional work experience and sparked my interest in higher education management, which isn't a career people tell you about during high school, but one that I've become really invested in and driven by, and that I'd like to stay involved in. As a staff member, the return benefits are plenty, and being able to mentor and see the impact of your support on an emerging leader is really rewarding, and having your work informed by those untapped but really relevant perspectives enhances the breadth and depth of your impact. And on the next slide, I have the outcome of the co-designed and drafted work. So this is what I was speaking about earlier, the safety, respect, care, consent, student support strategy, and you won't be able to read it on the screen, but what I did want to highlight is the co-signatures down the bottom between me and the Vice Chancellor, which I think is a powerful signal of our partnership in promoting gender equality and preventing gender-based violence in and outside of our community. And equally important to this conversation is student leadership structures. On top of studies and today's challenges, student leadership is a hard thing to do. And I first became involved as a naive Year 12 student procrastinating from my exam preparation. I saw a call come out for student advocacy officers on my university email, which I'd set up from procrastinating at another time, but thought I'd try my luck by applying. And through that role and being taken seriously from my first day stepping foot on campus, I've been able to meet who I like to call my uni mums and dads, so academic and professional staff and senior students who really helped me personally and professionally to understand how the world and our organization work, my role within both of those things and the impact that I can have. And also more broadly, how I can translate that to post-university employment and continuing to be an advocate in this space in different contexts. Speaking to experiences as a student leader in the student association, we were able to contribute to committees and decision-making bodies, and we were supported by staff to ensure that our governance as a student association, which can sometimes be difficult because they're often legally separate to the university, which I think is, of course, how they're supposed to operate, but it leaves students unequipped to be able to govern those as well as you would be able to with more experience and knowledge. But we were supported to ensure that our governance was fit for purpose and equipped us and our subsidiary student associations to be active bystanders and cultivate a culture where everyone is safe and can thrive. We also have a compulsory points-based professional development program called Beyond Bond, which allows us to recognise students for their contributions and for them to evidence that to their potential employers, which speaks to what Tash was just talking about as well. Finally, but certainly not least, culture and norms are central to any progress in promoting gender equality and preventing gender-based violence in our universities. It starts, of course, with a sense of belonging and safety, but building on from that, I've got 4 elements that I perceive to be the extra pieces to that puzzle. Firstly, students need to be aware of the support services within the university and also the interjurisdictional support like police, clinics, hospitals, and hotlines. And I've got these on the next slide. Secondly, students and student leaders need to be equipped with active bystander and affirmative consent training. Students don't need to know the legislation or national code, but they do need to know how to make a difference and how they can do that safely. Thirdly, we have student champions who walk the talk and set the standard for what we're trying to achieve here. They mightn't be elected student leaders, but they've self-identified as someone who's passionate about these issues and who seeks the opportunities to play a role in the change. Finally, we need to engage young men. I'm the eldest of 3 brothers, so the house was never quiet growing up, but we were all told that it's okay to be who we are without the influence of outdated ideas of masculinity. My points on the next slide. I acknowledge that today's young men are challenged in many ways: screens and gaming, friends, alcohol and drugs, emotions, and a lot more. And the world is tempestuous, there's a lot going on, and there are emerging negative role models which do make matters worse. But there's a pedagogic discomfort in challenging and unsettling, taken for granted, and deeply embedded ways of feeling, knowing, and being. But if young men's comfort remains at the center of these conversations, I think it'll be difficult for them to see gender equality as an issue that pertains to or matters to them. This is where positive and supportive male peer relationships need to be fostered in all areas, but perhaps more importantly, it's the active bystander training and equipping young men with the confidence and awareness to call out behaviours that we don't accept. In closing and bringing it all to an end, I haven't been the student president for about 6 months now, but I feel as included and valued in university decision making now as I did back then when I had that official hat on. And to explain with a recent example, I walked past one of our senior leaders, and it happens with most of our senior leaders around the place. But they say, Saxon, I've been meaning to reach out to you. I need to get your thoughts on something. And I often walk away from those conversations and I'm like, they know how to do their job. I trust them completely. I don't think they need my thoughts, but to have that is a really special thing, and to feel so valued so long after taking that hat off has been a great experience, and it evidences to me that the care factor is extremely high for student voice here at Bond. On that note, I'll wrap up, and I wanted to say thank you again. Other very minor things that I could impart would just be to um, go to the student level, have coffee with students, acknowledge the ones, and identify the people that are real culture leaders in this space. Student training and support should be tailored to them and cohort specific. And there's a lot to do, and Lucy will continue on and provide some more advice there. But I also welcome any questions or emails or outreach and further discussions on engaging students in the conversation. But thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Saxon. I know our audience here today will have really appreciated your extremely insightful and nuanced personal perspective on student voice and experience. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. A reminder that we will be accepting questions for all our presenters today, so please do make use of the Q&A function in Zoom if you're looking to follow up on any nuggets of wisdom today. But before we get there, we will hear, of course, from Lucy. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Freya. Okay, so hi, I'm Lucy. My pronouns are she, they. I'm coming to you from Nipaluna, Hobart in Lutruwita, Tasmania, which is the lands of the Palawa people. And I often swim in the river down here, and I know that the Palawa women were responsible for a lot of the ocean craft and fishing and hunting. And so every time I feel lucky enough to share those waterways, I feel a kind of deep connection and gratitude to the First Nations folks of this beautiful land. I am gonna kind of build on, I suppose, some of the stuff that you've heard today. I feel like some of the content will overlap, but it's through a different lens, and I'm hoping that that will help to deepen or broaden or stimulate more thinking about some of the concepts that we've already discussed. And I think it builds really nicely. And thank you, Saxon and Tash, for laying such a beautiful foundation for me. All right, next slide, please. So I want to acknowledge that learning does not happen in a vacuum. Universities replicate and sometimes amplify societal systems of oppression. So I think that often we think of universities as these kind of like raised up, like the ivory tower notion, but it's kind of in a bubble and insulated from the rest of society. And it often historically has meant that those systems of oppression are seen as outside of those institutions rather than founding forces that continue to influence and sometimes worsen those experiences of marginalization. Next one, please. So thinking about the power asymmetries that exist in higher education, there's the power asymmetry between student and staff, and Saxon talked about some really beautiful ways that they have experienced that power divide being really intentionally worked around. But if we think about other areas, thanks, beautiful. There's all these other ways that power asymmetries exist in higher education. And I think we don't spend quite enough time talking about those at the systemic level, all the way down to the micro level of interactions between students and staff, and students and their peers, and staff and their peers. So what I want to emphasize is that sometimes people talk about kind of getting rid of power or equalizing power. That's not a concept that I'm on board with. I don't believe that we can equalize power. I am white and I grew up in a white supremacist country. I will always have white privilege, and even if I work in really anti-racist intentional ways, I will never not have that power. But I do think we can disrupt power when we choose to work in radically different ways. So this is a student engagement framework from the UK. It talks about a spectrum that moves from student voice all the way through to student action. I want to highlight that when we think about this framework, we're not prioritizing or emphasizing any of the different ways of engaging students as better or worse than others. All of these different ways of engaging with students in higher education are equally valuable. They're all really necessary. I think we do some better than others, or at least we do some more frequently and more commonly than others. So on the student voice side, we've got students as evaluators of their experiences. So that's some very classic, focus groups, surveys, that kind of asking students what they think and using that as evaluation data. It usually stops there, and then we take those experiences, and then the people in higher positions of power make the decisions about what to do with those things. We then can move into students as participants in decision making, and the student rep system that Saxon talked about is a very classic example of students as participants in decision making. And then we move more to student action, which Tash mentioned, thinking about students as partners. And I'm seeing questions in the chat. I'm going to come back to those. Otherwise, I'll get distracted. My neurodivergent brain's like, oh, new thing. Also, doing this without being able to see your face is hard, because I think I make a funny joke and then nobody laughs and I'm like, nobody likes me. So we've got, moving up to student action, students as partners, co-creators and experts. This is where that really collaborative model that Tash talked about and Saxon gave some examples around, where students are seen as colleagues and experts in their own lived experiences, typically of being students within that student engagement framework. However, that framework has been applied to bring in lived experiences of other forms of power asymmetries, some of the ones that we listed on the slide before. And then students as agents for change is really at that empowerment level that Tash talked about in the trauma-informed principles, where we are situating students as leaders, and then staff and universities are playing enabling roles in facilitating that leadership to happen. All right, next one, please, Dan. So research in student-staff partnership shows that that kind of way of engaging students contributes to the success of marginalized student cohorts. Why do we think that is? So a systemic literature review of students partners initiatives from across a lot of different countries highlighted that these are the sorts of outcomes that happen when we work with students in those radically different ways. So yes, you get that kind of academic, they perform better academically, and yes, that's a great outcome, but these are the sorts of things that curriculum tend to not as frequently target as skills or experiences for students. But all of these things are things that typically students from historically silenced backgrounds don't have, or have less of, when they come into universities. And so experiencing and developing these outcomes through their engagement experiences with staff and other students in higher education goes some way to disrupting those power hierarchies. Okay, next one. So why does this matter in gender-based violence prevention initiatives? Good question, Lucy. On the next slide, that's because research also shows that gender-based violence impacts students from marginalized cohorts at disproportionately high rates. So when we think about students from those backgrounds that we listed before, and this is population-wide, not students, but students are a representation of our population. Students from those marginalized backgrounds are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. And we need to acknowledge that those who know it live it best. So that really references Tash's reference to what was originally the South African disability movement, the nothing about us without us kind of ethos. So how do we optimize partnership-based engagement to intentionally create space for inclusion of marginalized students in gender-based violence prevention? My approach is that you have to apply a power lens to everything. So the framework that I use on the next slide for a power lens is intersectionality. There's probably a lot of people in here who have expertise in this, possibly more than mine. It's a feminist framing that is a lens for seeing how various forms of inequality operate together and exacerbate each other. So we tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to many or all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of the parts. Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black American feminist, and this is her framework. It's a feminist framework, and it really talks about the cumulative effects of marginalization. So if you are a Black woman, your experience is different of gender from a white woman or a Black man. So those sorts of things are cumulative, and they really tailor what the experience is like and how appropriate our response is to gender-based violence for those unique intersecting lived experiences. So the next slide gives you a little bit of an understanding of how complex intersectionality is. We start at the outside of the circle and think about the environmental context. So this takes into account colonization, capitalism, legal systems, politics, wars, those sorts of things that are universally experienced and often cross borders. We then move into the ways that systems of oppression work. So things like racism, heteronormatism, heteronormativity and heterosexism, classism, ethnocentrism, transphobia, all of those kind of systemic marginalizing systems, and how they impact people based on their own identity. So as a queer, disabled, neurodivergent person and a victim survivor of sexual violence, I tick some of these boxes, but I also tick a whole wealth of like privilege boxes. And so my experiences of being queer is moderated by my experiences of being white, as are my experiences of being disabled, and so on. And then that shifts within context. So when I'm within my queer community, I never feel any kind of transphobia or homophobia, because that's not something that in that context manifests. But then I shift context and I might experience those things in, for example, health systems is a particularly big one. So what I've done, I do a lot of community engagement work, and I specialize in community engagement and student engagement for intersectionally marginalized communities. And through my practice and drawing on a lot of people who have a lot more knowledge than I do, I've come up with a framework for intersectional and trauma-informed approaches to student engagement. I'm going to talk you through each of those and then give some examples. So this is where you'll see some overlap with Tash, but hopefully you'll see the layering of intersectionality on top of that trauma-informed principles. So the first one is to honor diverse knowledges. And one of the things I think is hilarious is if you type knowledges into Microsoft Word, it automatically tells you that that's not a word and it's not spelt right, because the plurality of knowledges is not something that's actually in our Western dictionary. And I think that says a lot about the kind of colonial context that we're working with. So stepping outside of the kind of Western ways of knowing, we need to acknowledge that knowledges are plural and they're all equally valuable. The example that I've got here is when you are doing recruitment for any kind of student engagement opportunity, asking about intersectional diversity in that process, and then selecting intentionally for a wide range of lived experiences is a practice that I've gotten into. There's certain trauma-informed ways to do that. I don't want to just put it on a survey form and ask people, how was your experiences of discrimination and oppression? But taking that trauma-informed approach to understanding people's intersectional experiences to ensure that you've got a lot of different experiences of both privileges and barriers in the students that you're working with. And importantly, following up on that, in that if you bring diversity in the room, it's then your job to ensure they can all contribute their knowledges equitably, and that requires a really tailored approach. Next up. Acknowledge trauma. So everyone has trauma. Now that we've all been through a global pandemic, I can say that very confidently. Even if we haven't, I would say that everybody has experienced some kind of trauma in their lifetime. Some of us more than others. And it's really important to start by acknowledging that everyone holds trauma in their bodies in some kind of different ways, but also existing in marginalized and intersecting identities is a form of trauma experiences, and acknowledging that when we approach working with students who come from diverse backgrounds, that's a framework that they'll exist within. So the example that I've got here is ensuring that in any project that you do, any gender-based violence initiative, I would say that if you come up with a suite of training, which is what I recommend, ensuring that everybody, both students and staff, receive trauma-informed practice training as a mandatory part of initiatives or projects. So analysing power, this is that intersectional framework, understanding where it's held and absent, and how those systems of oppression intersect. And a massive part of this power analysis is self-reflection. So the example that I've got here, and this is an activity that I do in nearly all of my trauma-informed or intersectionality workshops, is undertake an individual and collective intersectional power mapping activity that promotes self-reflection about our own experiences of privilege and oppression, acknowledging that we all share privileges and experiences of trauma and marginalization. I like to say that we all will experience marginalization at some point in our life, because even if you are the most privileged, cis, able-bodied, straight, white man, you will get old. And at that point, you might experience like age-based discrimination. So taking away that kind of us and them approach to understanding power and acknowledging that we are unified in that experience in different ways. So the next one is centering safety. So ensuring that people are as much as possible and able to feel physically, socially, culturally, and emotionally safe, but also acknowledging that that safety is actually an unattainable situation for some people, and that has to be okay. And it's something that we work towards rather than something we necessarily achieve all the time. But most importantly, how are students able to contribute their ideas, give feedback without risking recrimination or retaliation. So the example I have here is that providing really flexible and multiple mechanisms for contributions and feedback, which always include an anonymous pathway, is really important. Things like silent dialogues, things like Padlet and online platforms that allow for like collaboration anonymously and in real time, obviously anonymous surveys, those sorts of things, but getting really creative about how people are able to contribute their knowledge. Building trust, and this goes back to Tasha's talking about trustworthiness. A big part of this for me is a willingness to be vulnerable. Research on trustworthiness says that one of the best ways to build trust is to share parts of yourself that are vulnerable, and then trust that the other person will be benevolent enough not to take advantage of that. So in the example that I've got here, sharing parts of yourselves as humans. So me starting by saying that I'm like a queer, disabled, neurodivergent victim survivor of sexual assault. That's me being vulnerable with you and trusting that you won't say anything particularly discriminatory in the chat, for example. It's a simple way of me providing ways to connect with you that show the human parts of myself that professionals in professional environments are often required to remove. And I think that takes us much further away from trauma-informed practice and trust-based relationships. Building in opportunities for socially getting to know each other. Food is a great builder of relationships and trust. And then Tash touched on this, saying what you'll feasibly be able to do and then doing what you say. One of the quickest ways to break trust is to break promises or break expectations. So being really realistic about that from the outset. Enabling voice and choice. The example I have for this one is around starting with you and your self-reflection. So ask yourself at every stage of collaborating with students, am I making a decision here? And if the answer is yes, consider ways that students can make those decisions for themselves. So for example, community engagement programs and student engagement programs that I've run with people with lived experiences of marginalization and trauma, we always pay or we always recognize, but giving people the way that they get paid is a decision that they make. So whether it's in cash, whether it's in bank transfer, whether it's in gift cards, whether it's in Visa debit cards, what kind of gift cards. So it's not taking that paternalistic approach to assuming that you know best what is for those people and allowing people to tailor those options to their own situations. And that's just one tiny example of the ways that we can build in voice and choice at every stage. So collaboration, we've touched on this a little bit before, but in the example that I've got here, my biggest piece of advice is bring students in at the very earliest stage possible. The extent to which you can collaborate with students is severely hindered by the lateness at which you bring them into the project. So bringing students in at the beginning or as early as the beginning as possible, acknowledging that as staff, we have power to initiate a project more so than students often do. So we will be able to start earlier than them, but integrating opportunities for them to co-design the project plans, the outcomes, the metrics for success, and to reflect iteratively and collectively is really, really important. facilitating empowerment. And I like to think about this as self-empowerment rather than empowerment that is given or bestowed upon other people from my place of power. So how am I enabling the people that I work with to identify their own strengths, to decide where they want to build capability, and to model distributed leadership through things like shared decision making. So in this example, don't decide what, where, or how students will contribute. It's very common to have a project plan for a grant application that says students will help us do X, Y, Z. I would encourage you to write a grant that says we will bring students in early and they will tell us what their strengths are, where they want to develop, and what they want to do, and then we will enable that in a partnership approach. And the last one is keep doing the work. So repeating these steps over and over and over again. So the example that I've got here is that partnership ways of working are a mindset that underlie a set of practices. So I've given you practical examples, but all of those are possible and natural because it comes from a mindset that's developed over years of practice that is constant and evolving, just like I am and just like you are. So the core aspect of this mindset is self-reflection and self-awareness, so that as you evolve, your mindset and then your practices should too. And that happens best in dialogue with people who are different from ourselves, from intersecting backgrounds. And so I will leave you there. My next slide has my contact details. If you want to follow up with any questions that we don't have time for today, just reach out. I'd love to hear from you. And I think I nailed the timing. So good.
About to say, you did that expertly, down to the second. Thank you so much, Lucy, for those brilliant insights. Such an informative session examining intersectionality and frameworks for collaboration, relationship building, and power redistribution within the university landscape. Thank you so much. We are thrilled now to welcome all of our presenters back and give you the opportunity to ask your pressing questions. We've got 15 or so minutes to get through as many of these as we can. So the first question I might ask, open to all of our presenters, whoever'd like to take a crack at this first, is many universities establish student committees. However, these committees don't have actual decision-making capacity. Do you have any advice for how students can work with universities to get a seat at the actual decision-making table rather than being pushed off to the side? Go for it, Lucy.
Well, does Saxon want to go first? You're the student expert in this place. So maybe Saxon, if you have something you want to say, you start out and then I'll follow up.
Build. Beautiful.
Thanks, Lucy. Definitely. So it's actually really important to have student voice, both from elected leaders and unelected leaders, and people who come to university, do their classes and go home, as well as the people who are really invested in the university leadership space and contribute to that as a student leader. So the best ways for us to engage with student leaders and bring them into that conversation is by, as Lucy was just speaking about, bringing them into it as at the earliest stage. And one really positive example that we have at the moment is our core curriculum. And through one of the core curriculum subjects, collaboration for global change, students address one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they come up with a project that could be implemented at the university. And so that's a really great way that we're able to identify emerging leaders and people who can contribute to the UN SDGs at Bond, gender equality being one of them, and to support them in giving that perspective and also connecting them with the right staff and more senior students to facilitate that. So I think for us, it's that mix of going out and engaging with people on the ground and going to their level, but also recognizing and putting forward those names who have evidenced that interest in this space.
Beautiful. Thank you, Saxon. Lucy, did you want to add anything to that answer?
Yeah, I love being outside universities now so that I can say whatever I want without getting a smack on the wrist from my academic institution. I like to tell students to own their power. Universities are increasingly held to account for including student voices in these sorts of things, and if they don't, it looks really bad for them. And if they, I was going to swear, if they if students have a bad experience, disgruntled students can be exceptionally powerful in damaging the reputation of universities. As a student in university, I didn't recognize the power that I had over the institution, and that's why it's built like that, is to make sure that, you know, you stay in your place. So now when I'm invited to sit on advisory panels, I say, well, what influence over decision-making capacity do I actually have? And if it's none, I won't join the panel. And if enough students refuse to engage in tokenistic, like inappropriate consultation processes that don't actually give them any level of influence, it'll start to shift the dial. That needs to be a collective action. So student unions do this really well. I don't think enough students are involved with their union. And this is a bit of a unionist perspective. And I'm not telling all students to go on strike, but like, but that kind of notion of collective action is really important in this space. And I think that students increasingly are owning that power, and I would invite them to step into that power to ensure that they have the actual seat at the table that they deserve, because universities actually can't do the work without them anymore, at least not reputationally.
Yeah. Cash, you had your hand up. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there's so much that students can do, but I think there's so much that student committees are probably already doing. Just, you know, or sometimes feels like talking to a brick wall when they're trying to make change at that institutional level. So I think hopefully the focus is shifting to university decision makers about how they're opening up doors and pathways for students to be able to meaningfully contribute. I think that the national code will likely change and support this in some ways. But another idea I was thinking about was, you know, when you're bringing your ideas to the university, it helps to speak their language a bit by framing it around the shared goals that you have with the institution. So student safety, well-being, the university's reputation, of course, and even their legal obligations. So HDR students who also are staff, there's a positive duty obligation that universities have to meet around your safety. So when your advocacy can line up with what they already say they care about, it can be seen as contributing and, you know, helping the university meet its own commitments as well.
Fantastic.
I think, sorry,
Sorry,
yes,
go ahead.
and not asking students to erase their identity through enforced code switching in terms of being forced to conform to the professional standards of universities. And I do think universities, especially when working with marginalized groups, don't do enough to accommodate different ways of working that are more culturally appropriate for the kinds of students that they say they want to work with.
Brilliant. My lovely colleague and university leader now, Georgia Killick, has her hand up. Georgia, did you want to ask something?
I can't help
contribute?
myself. I'm too passionate about the space. I did just want to say a really key point in my experience on this is timing. Universities often want student committees to adhere to their timing schedule and their calendar year. It's really important that as staff working in the space, you consider and are really transparent about when you're going to need decisions made, and starting to think, you know, where is there flexibility? When can we push this decision back if it means we're actually going to have student voices in the room? There's no point having a meeting on the 8th of January that works well for staff when you know you've got no students on campus. And that really has to be central. To keeping those voices is timing.
Thank you, Georgia. Saxon, we had a lovely two-part question come through for you. What is the best advice you could give student leaders in this evolving environment? And how did you navigate your boundaries being a student yourself while also being a leader?
Thanks for passing that on, Freya. I think for student leaders, and I've had an exceptional experience here at Bond, and as I've said a few times, I am going to be really devastated to wrap up that student experience and move out into the real world. But I think from student leader to student leader, I have said to the succeeding president and their team that so much impact comes from that secret ingredient, which is the productive engagement between students and staff. And it's to articulate ideas effectively, to partner productively with staff and students, but also to not get too lost in the university side of things, because I find as a student leader, you're doing a really, you're navigating a fine line between doing some really fantastic work at university executive level, but you need to make sure that you are also picking up and consulting with your peers. And that can be something that in the midst of everything is the thing that you might push to the side because you think yourself that you have this really well-rounded idea, but you need to go back out and tap into the perspectives and experiences of your peers. And secondly, it is a hard job, and being student president, I think I was working probably full-time hours and studying full-time. So it was a really big thing to navigate, but to be able to see the impact and have built the relationships with students and to walk past everyone and know every single person that you walk past, and for them to recognize the impact that you have on their student experience, that was something that made it all a whole lot more manageable. But I was really grateful and lucky to have those uni mums and dads and those mentors that I spoke of earlier, and to have such fantastic people in my support ecosystem who acknowledged when it was too much, and who worked with me to ensure that we were achieving those good outcomes that we were looking for. And that came down to a lot of things like reviewing what our organizational structure looked like for the student association. And the most challenging piece for me probably would have been people management and being able to motivate a group of student elected leaders who are volunteers and to maintain their motivation during their tenure. And so I had a lot of support in our governance reviews, our organizational structure reviews, and really setting up the successive leaders for success so that my learnings and experiences could support them in having a more seamless and enjoyable student leadership experience. So it was challenging, of course, to navigate those two roles, but I think you put the hats on yourself, and it's been a great experience for time management and feeling really well-rounded to go out into the workforce now. So I've been grateful for the experience and we'll do it all over again in a heartbeat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Zach. And then just with the 1 to 2 minutes remaining, Tash, I might just ask you, just building on your presentation, if you could share an example or two of how Full Stop have really meaningfully incorporated diverse student voices into your training program.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reflecting on this, and one of the most meaningful engagements we had was actually a one-on-one engagement. We were developing our ethical pedagogical practices program, which is a series of prevention-based modules aimed at higher degree research supervisors. And in undertaking that research, we connected with a young woman who had been sexually harassed by her HDR supervisor, and we engaged in her in a really extensive consultation. Initially, the plan was to, with her permission, use her experience as a case scenario and jumping off point that would thread all of the modules together. And we did do that. She helped us develop the case scenario. We tested it out. We made sure that it felt okay, like it was fully de-identified and its information changed. But throughout that process and in that scenario, she shared not only the horrific things that she had been subjected to by that supervisor, but also the ongoing long-term impacts of that, and that informed the scenario. It also ended up informing a lot of the framework that we developed. It ended up informing the content of the modules, the discussion, and as part of that consultation with her, we worked with her across every single module to ensure that, the things that we want people to discuss, the critical thinking that we want them to do about abuse of power, about ethical bystanders, impacts of sexual harassment, were embedded throughout, because her story really pinned it all together. And then we also shared all of the feedback with her, the qualitative and quantitative feedback from those supervisors. And one of the most consistent messages that came through the feedback was that scenario was so shaking for a lot of the participants in the room, because they had seen those things play out as one incident here, one incident there, but they never connected how all of that coexists. And that was the thing that spurred a lot of them into action and started for them to think about how they engage with supervisees, how they can create their own ethical frameworks, and the incredible isolation and vulnerability of HDR supervisees. So for me, that was probably one of the most meaningful engagements with a survivor advocate.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tash. And thank you, all three of you, for taking the time today to share your incredible expertise and experience in this space. I'm sorry we couldn't get to any more questions, but as you would have seen, all our presenters shared their contact details. So if you'd like to follow up, that's there. We highly value and appreciate the work all three of you have done and continue to do in preventing gender-based violence in universities. Thank you so much for being here today. Before we move to our wrap up, we just ask that you, as attendees, take out your phones and scan this QR code to complete a quick 2-minute survey on today's session. Jess, our digital moderator, will also drop the link into the chat. The survey is obviously entirely voluntary, and your generous feedback is invaluable. It really helps us to understand the impact of our work and to improve future sessions. And taking part also reinforces the role you play in shaping these really meaningful conversations and ultimately helping us to drive change. Jess, I think, will also share details about our data collection policy in the chat. Just a reminder to reach out to any of the support line numbers that Dan just popped back up on the screen if you're feeling impacted by the discussion today at all. And then in terms of ways to connect, you can continue your learning and development by engaging with us further in the following ways. You can find out about professional development opportunities and new resources by subscribing to our new universities mailing list, by clicking on the link provided in the chat or emailing universities@ourwatch.org.au. You can visit the Our Watch University's website at www.tertiaryeducation.ourwatch.org.au to review our university-related frameworks, tools, and resources. And of course, you can follow Our Watch on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn for updates on our work in universities and across all settings. And finally, thank you so much again to our presenters, Tash, Saxon, and Lucy, for your wonderful presentations. Thank you to the Our Watch team and our digital moderator, Jess. And thank you, all of you, for attending and sharing in this invaluable conversation the importance of effective and meaningful student engagement to support the prevention of gender-based violence. We hope to see you at the next webinar, which will have a focus on the teaching and learning domain later in the year. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.